Okay, I'll start with a couple of questions and a confession. First is, did we really need another book about Butte, Montana? I mean, there's so many of them. And you kind of hesitate to write another one, because gosh. And then, did we need a memoir? You know, I don't know. You know, that's what I ended up doing. I tried to write other kinds of books, but that's what happened. And then here's my confession. Growing up here, I never, ever thought I would write about this town. I was scribbling all the time as a kid, but I never did think that I would write about Butte. I knew interesting things happened in Butte, but I didn't think my life was one of them, so I wouldn't want to write about that. But here we are. Here's a book by Aaron Pierrette, also from Butte, and it's Literary Butte, and it's a survey of all sorts of books about Butte. And in it he says, an astonishing number of writers have chosen Butte, Montana as the setting for their work. An astonishing number have, and yet the books keep coming. This won't be the last one. My friend Milana Marcinich is writing her third book about Butte, even as we speak. Well, she better be. I have to give her a pep talk if she's not. So, according to Aaron Pierrette, the first book about Butte, the first novel was called A Blind Lead, and that was in 1888 by a woman called Josephine White Bates, and it was kind of about the Butte Silver Age. And A Blind Lead, maybe some guys and gals know this, is that was a term, a mining term, and in this book it meant this guy had evidence on his claim of silver, and there was some silver, but he thought it led to a rich vein around the corner, and that wasn't necessarily so. And then the book had a parallel plot about somebody who was in love with a woman in love with a guy, and that was another blind lead, because she thought his love was just around the corner, and that was, it wasn't necessarily so either. It sounds like, I haven't read it, it sounds interesting. But anyway, what is astonishing with all these books, you consider the size of the town, you know. It's no New York City, you know, to be a literary town. And it's not that old. New York City's 400 years old. But it seems older. And I've often thought of that. And it's because so much has happened here. And one day I thought of an analogy. It's with, remember in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, when at the end of the movie, Indiana Jones is just exhausted. He overdosed on Daring Do or something. He's just feeling bad. And then his lady love said, "You're growing older before your time, Indy." And he looks at her and he says, "It's not the years, honey, it's the mileage." And that has always seemed so true about Butte. The mileage, a lot of mileage rolled up here. There's a lot of stories. And often, it was the novels that caught top billing. Aaron Pierrette mostly talks about novels, and he dips into the movies and talks about things in television. He even mentions Homer Simpson watching the Miss Montana pageant in the cartoon, and Homer says, "Oh, it's a Butte from Butte," you know, he says Miss Montana. And I actually tried to do his voice, but boy, you can't do that. Though as far as I know, there are no video games about Butte. Like, anybody know about is there a War of the Copper Kings video game? Oddly enough, there's a real popular video game called Minecraft. And my great nephew heard that this book talked about copper mining. And he was 9 or 10, and he said, "Oh, what can you tell me about copper?" And so I started telling him some of the few things I knew, and he was just bewildered. He said, "Well, I know from Minecraft that you take 2 copper ingots and a piece of amethyst, you can make a spyglass. And I said, oh, okay, well that must be Minecraft. I don't know that. And also I like to think about how many different kinds of novels. There are romances and westerns and hard-boiled mysteries. The most famous novel about Butte is probably Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett. And that was as hard-boiled as you could get. And there were literary novels, which people wanted to write a literary novel. And that was, in 20th century American literature, the novel was, boy, that was the big thing to write. It was, if you were interested in writing as an art, you would take a stab at writing a literary novel and writing about life as she is lived, as the old guys used to say. You wouldn't write a memoir, because memoirs were considered an inferior form. The big literary guns, if they made a big impression, they might, just throw out a memoir, but it wasn't something that people thought was real cool. If you did have memoir content, you kind of smuggled it in. You put it in there, and you said, oh, well, this isn't a memoir, it's just an autobiographical novel. On the Road by Jack Kerouac or something like that. That was all his experience, but had to market it as a novel. A River Runs Through It, which is one of the most famous novels about Montana. That was marked, it's actually a novella, but they made it into a movie, and it was considered fiction. But if you look into it, Norman MacLean had a brother named Paul, who was one of the central characters. And one of the central events is the death of Paul. And that's what happened to Norman MacLean's brother. He was beaten to death. He did change it a little. He was, Paul died in Chicago rather than Montana, but he was a gambler and a hellraiser, and that happened. It was autobiographical. And the Butte novels, this is a really good Butte novel called Mile High, Mile Deep by Richard O'Malley. And also, it has a great cover. That's from an oil painting by Russell Chatham, and I just love the light on that. Anyway, there's O'Malley, and his book. It is said to be a novel, but apparently it was just a framework for all these stories he had about growing up in Butte in the 1920s. And here's a real interesting case. This is a novel called The Thin Air Gang. This is hard to get a hold of. I had to send away for it. But it's by Ed Leahy, who was a Butte poet. He died a few years back. And it was about bootleggers in the 1930s in Butte. It's supposed to be a novel. But you turn and you look at it, and on the back it says, although presented in the form of a novel, this might be also said to be a memoir, with events and characters altered as needed to make the tale flow, and perhaps also to sell a little better. I don't know. But it's a memoir. I don't know if the cover shows up that well. That's a very old photograph, but it's a photograph of an illegal distillery. If you see the barrels and the pipes, that's what it is. And this bootlegger guy was Ed Leahy's father. So it sounds like a memoir to me. Things started to change. People became more interested in memoirs later on. There's a famous one called Stop Time by Frank Conroy, and it's a memoir, and it made kind of a splash. And then eventually the National Book Award, a judge from that panel said to Frank Conroy, gee, that's a good book. We would have given it Book of the Year if only it was a novel. See? Gosh, the things we have to put up with. Anyway, it took me a real long time to catch on to all this going on. When I was growing up, as I say, I was scribbling all the time. It's kind of overwhelming. You look at the blank page and you try and think, gosh, I gotta fill that up. So one of the things I did in the first story I wrote to the end was I said, gee, the world is so complicated. I'll just end the world and that'll simplify things. And I should, I have it in here. I'll tell you a little bit about that story I wrote. I was like 15 or 16. And as I said, I ended the world in it. The first line went something like, boom, and 2 wind-blown blossoms floated down the midnight air. World War II was involved, and those blossoms were parachutes of a couple airmen ejecting from their exploding airplane and drifting down into the Andes. I kept getting distracted from the end of the world by a sideshow involving these guys losing themselves in mysterious caverns and discovering Inca treasure hidden for centuries. Kind of, maybe could have been the Indiana Jones in there. And so on, but that was okay. I ended up with plenty of color and action, but I couldn't figure out a way to end it until I hit upon cannibalism. Yeah. Of course, you can't write your way out of a corner with cannibalism for every story, though it does end things with finality. There'd be no ambiguity in Gone with the Wind if when Rhett said, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn, the next and final line would have been, so Scarlet devoured him, that's no muss, no fuss, and don't have to worry about a sequel.
That would have been rather Greek.
Yeah. Here's an interesting aside, a Butte aside on that. There was an authorized sequel to Gone with the Wind. It was called Rhett Butler's People, and it was written by Donald McCaig from this town, from Butte. I've never read it myself, but it's kind of interesting. He wrote, you've seen it around, the Butte Polka, which is a pretty good novel. But I was writing in my early days all over the place. I didn't want to write about Butte. I wanted to escape Butte in those days, and I didn't see how writing about Butte would help me with that. I had a bad case of something that happens, and that is you get a bad case of get the hell out of the hometown syndrome. And I was distracted. So I was distracted in my late adolescence by the 1960s. And there's been so much written about those days that it's people kind of glaze over and they hear, oh yeah, the 60s. But, particular things happened in here during the 60s. And we were, there was something in the air across America, and a lot of the people I knew in high school, I graduated Central in 1970, we really wanted to just get out there and get going. All these things were happening. So, and we didn't do much. Some of us took off and went to California, and some came back and with kind of interesting stories and interesting attitudes. But mostly we stayed home and wore blue jeans all the time and listened to rock and roll and kind of gave in to the general shagginess of the time. And, it wasn't enough. We needed to do more, though it was too much for some people in town. Mr. Joe Roberts of Roberts Tire Company, I don't know if anybody remembers this. He put up a billboard at the outskirts of town, and it said, had a real shaggy guy, and then the caption was, "Beautify America, get a haircut." Anybody remember that? Yeah. So people would just up and go off to California and come back. And I was having adventures in town, but I wasn't writing. Maybe I was having writer's block because I was having too much fun, And then I had to recover from the fun, and I think that gave me writer's block too. But I'll just read a little from the beginning and to give you a picture of what was going on. Take a look at a vintage U.S. Geological Survey map of Butte, and you'll see hundreds of X's peppering the ridges and gulches and flats surrounding Old Town, marking mining prospects that played out years ago or had been fruitless in the first place. But the trails up to those prospects were the beginnings of a rough maze of roads that turned out to be handy when you were growing up in Butte, when you were looking for somewhere to love somebody up, or to knock back a few tall, cool ones, or just to hide out for a while. In 1970, 71, 72, my gang would head out on the old roads to smoke marijuana. We'd ramble down gullies and round piles of tailings, through scrub, pine, and sage, past the random parked car with its own agenda. Sometimes one of our cars would bash an oil plant or a muffler, and once in the Badlands west of town, my family's car had to be towed when I somehow jolted the solenoid loose. At home at 2235 Grand Avenue, my folks, Howie and Millie, said something like, "All right, okay, so things happen, but exactly what were you doing out there?" And I said, "Oh, just driving around." Sometimes we'd head east instead of west, traveling Continental Drive towards the Piedmont slag heap and turning off on the road to the Columbia Gardens, an oasis in the foothills of the Rockies. We'd been out at the gardens dozens and dozens of times, but every Butte kid had. An oasis, sure, when we were growing up, but the way that we felt now, it was stale music. Sometimes we'd sneak into the grounds at night to make a game of hiding out from Ted. That would be Ted Beach. Once Byron and Brink and I gave people aliases in this. We did some kind of things that are not necessarily so respectable, so I just used different names. And also, I kind of honored the Butte tradition of nicknames by giving nicknames. We climbed up the old wooden roller coaster and started walking a circuit of the dark and slippery top level. And I did slip, my legs shooting out from under. I had to spread equal backwards to catch myself just before Ted spotted Byron and Brink. I heard him call out, "Are you two coming down, or am I going to shoot you down?" Yeah, that's what he said. I hushed and lay low in pain while Byron and Brink descended to hear Ted's tirade as he escorted them off the property. I climbed down and catch up with them later to laugh it over and also to deal with the splinter that had lanced through my jeans into my ass when I hit the track. But most often in those days, we'd take a left right before the gardens and the road would keep rising high above the roller coaster and carousel and arcades, above the Victorian wedding cake of the dance pavilion. We'd roam up into a tangle of secret geography, into places we called Roach Ridge or Doobie Hill, Doper's Garden, or the Belahashish Mine. And we'd smoke and talk and drink. By the way, it kind of kills me that we're doing something that was incredibly illegal, and yet you can buy stuff 10 times as strong as that stuff that we were hiding with. Yeah, it's just amazing. Sometimes dope seemed to be merely a subterfuge for the surge of talk about pretty much everything in the universe, religion and romance and rock and roll. Where we were at Roach Ridge was one of our favorite spots because it had the best view. You could see maybe a mile and a half to the northwest, the ripped open granite of the Berkeley Pit, the enormous open pit copper mine chomping away at the heart of Butte. A lot of these things people here know, but if somehow it gets out into the greater America, it's interesting to explain these things to people. Meaderville had already disappeared, Finntown was on its way, McQueen was going. The pit had taken out the Rocky Mountain Cafe, where you could have ordered elk ravioli, and Sacred Heart School, where a legendary nun used to hang bad kids up by their collars in the cloakroom. It had taken out Wing Avenue, named for my great-great-grandfather, Philip Wing. The underground mines were being phased out, too, in favor of the pit, but you could still see from our high point a few scattered head frames, marking the Mountain Con, the Kelly, the Bell Diamond. Gallows frames, that's kind of an interesting controversy about which to call it. The steel head frames were called, and they looked sort of like slightly off-kilter prehistoric Eiffel Towers, 100 feet tall. The pit kept growing every day. Every day they blasted at noon sharp. One of my friends walked aisles in her family's uptown grocery store. That would be the Deb Appleman in the Colorado Cash Grocery. She had to move imperiled cans away from the edges of the shelves right before the blast and check for fallen cans afterwards. One afternoon when we were up in the hills passing the pipe, John the Grin said something. When I was working at the pit, they made that blasting stuff by mixing fertilizer and diesel oil. And another guy replied, "That's pretty much what the IRA uses for car bombs." We imagined terrorists like the mix for the same reasons the Anaconda Company did. It was readily available, affordable, easy to handle and store, and you couldn't deny the stuff about the job done, whatever the job happened to be. Sometimes we'd be out there till night came on. Once as the lights of Butte blinked alive down below, the great Q, which that's an alias for a friend of mine who has since passed, a good friend, Mr. Art Noonan. Those lights, you see how they twinkle? Another town in America has lights that twinkle like that. It's due to the mineral exhalations. I thought, whatever those are, eh? That's confusing. At last, we'd always have to start the car up again and head back home, out of the hollows in the hills, rolling down the windows and traveling faster and faster to flush out the smoke. Someday, maybe we just keep going, jump on I-90 and head on the highway. Sometimes we seem to be caught between getting away from Butte forever and watching Butte disappear right before our eyes. But I could not write any of that stuff then. It just wouldn't come, and something was clogged up by all the stuff I was doing, and I wanted to write, but that stuff wouldn't come. I'll have to tell you when I did start writing again. I went to the University of Montana, and I took creative writing, and I took a poetry class, and the teacher was a well-known, probably the best-known Montana poet, Richard Hugo. And he was a big, balding man, and he had this, I'll just read from this book that an essay was published in later, the Iowa Review. He had this massive corrugated forehead. The first time I read one of my poems in class, Hugo studied a copy at his desk, head cocked to my voice. As I recall, this poem was a sort of cross between Andrew Marvell and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and it was a rant against, I hope I don't embarrass anybody, against virginity, a category I was then freshly and just barely delivered from. By the time I delivered my bang-up finish, Hugo's head had tilted the other way, and he frowned, a few beats of silence, and his head looked like a clenched bullet. Finally, he visibly relaxed and even brightened. He looked up, though not at me, and said to the back of his hand and the rest of the class, "You distract him while I sneak from the room." And, you know, people have misunderstood that over the years. They said, that was a wrong thing to say to a kid who's trying to write an interesting poem. But, you know, he was right. It was a mess. I wasn't really writing. I was wallowing in words. And that was okay that he'd said that. So I was ready for another approach to write stuff. And not long after this, I read a poem called Letter to Levertov from Butte by Hugo himself. And that's a letter to Denise Levertov, the British-American poet, who was a pal of Hugo's. And in this poem he said, "Butte is kind of like a microscopic Brooklyn, if you can imagine Brooklyn with open pit mines and more Irish than Jewish." And he wrote, "Dashiell Hammett based Red Harvest here, though he called it Personville, and person, he made sure to tell you, was poison in the slang, like Poisonville. And because so many people died here in mines and fights, early in history, man said, screw it, and the fun began." So I looked at the poem, and I said, okay, I get it, there's something to that. A mining town has fun and fatalism mix up a mining town sometimes, and I can understand that. There's a deep fatalistic streak, I think, in Butte. I think it was maybe related to the Irish. The Irish were jerked around all over the place by the British, and they moved here to be jerked around by an enormous corporation, so that was their attitude. But Hugo's poem, it left so much out. And he approached writing a poem about a town, but he didn't want to know too much about the town. He said if he actually knew things, did a little research and knew some facts about the place, and got away with his imagination. So that's what he did, and some of his poems are just great, but I had trouble with that one, because I knew too much about this place. And so I just had to respond to Richard Hugo. But I didn't just tell him he was wrong, I wrote another poem for his class. And it was a poem about getting in a fight when I was a kid, about looking north from my backyard at the scraped out skyline, about hearing sirens in the night, about gathering with a crowd and watching one more puzzle piece of Butte burn away. So I read this again in class, and this time, when I was finished, Hugo looked directly at me and nodded and said, all right. And that, from that man, was high praise. So I found out I could write about Butte, but dang, it took me a long time to be consistent about it. You think you make a breakthrough, but gosh, there's an awful lot of work still to do, if you're trying to write something worth writing. In 1985, I finally cracked the code and broke into publication. And it's not an impressive publication. It's just a little pamphlet, kind of newsprinty, and put out by the King County Arts Commission in Seattle. It's called The Written Arts. But I was tickled that, somebody thought it was worth putting in there. And I called it the Berkeley Pit. And I think I wrote this because when I was a kid, I was really impressed by the Berkeley Pit, I had never gone down underground into a mine, so I didn't know what was going on. But the Berkeley Pit was sure as hell out in open, It was right there, and it just looked cool. It seemed to me like one Christmas Butte got a starter's kit for a Grand Canyon of its own. It was just, boy, I thought that was cool. And I didn't realize till later that this was when I was 3.5 when they started the pit. And I didn't realize that I was older than the pit. That was a strange feeling. And so the Berkeley Pit was a big deal, and then they closed it, and that was a big deal. And I had a reaction to that. I wrote this strange story. This kid was maybe 8 or 9 or 10, and he was obsessed with the Berkeley Pit. He was terrified. He came up with this legend in his mind that the coppers stole the copper out of the earth, and somehow it awakened the pit. And now the pit was devouring everything in town, trying to get the copper back. So this kid would steal copper wire and copper jewelry and pipes and pennies and copper ornaments, and he'd take it back and throw it over the fence, and he was hoping to satiate the beast, if you will. Hey, they published it, what the hell?
Cool.
Yeah. Eventually I said, geez, I'm starting to do stuff. I should write something substantial about Butte, something big. And of course I thought of a novel, and other people thought of a novel. My brother Dave came up to me and he said, so when are you going to write your Butte novel? And oh gosh, I was trying, But things kept falling apart as I tried to write, or more accurately, my scribbles and notes and fragments didn't come together. I wanted to write something that wasn't, there's these well-trodden paths, There's this speculator disaster, there's the Copper Kings, there's the labor wars, and we know a lot about those, and I was hoping, they're not the only good stories, and I was hoping to strike out and say something. I didn't know how novels happened, and I tried out some real weird things, like I tried inventing a fourth Copper King, and that didn't work. I tried writing, the novel movie Accidental Tourist, which is kind of about domestic comedy. I tried to write like Ann Tyler, which I couldn't do, and write a domestic comedy. That didn't work. There's a famous novel called 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is called Magic Realism, and he has a century-long family saga. I tried to do that. That didn't work. I wrote a story where Dashiell Hammett visited Butte. If he really did, that's another story. That's a little controversial in some affairs. I'm not sure if he actually did, but I won't talk about that now. But I wrote this story where he visited Butte and he had an affair, and that resulted in a kid who grew up to, I can't tell you what the kid grew up to do. The kid is still stranded somewhere in my notes. A lot of these characters are stranded in my notes. One of them is this Irish god this was a fantasy, an Irish god lost in a copper mine. Now he's lost in the note somewhere too. Not so many characters made it out of the note stage. I'd say, has anybody ever heard of the Crown Fire Mine? I didn't think so, I made it up. It's in the note. But then memoirs got, I don't catch on fast, but memoirs got more respectable, like, Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt about Ireland, and Mary Carr wrote a book called The Liars Club, and these were considered respectable. And so I started looking through my stuff, and all these scribbles and notes and essays and fragments and blind leads, and I was slowly able to weave them together. And I looked, and there's this chunk and this chunk, and this stuff happened, and I never quite looked at it at the right angle before, and I never knew how to put it together, and so I did, and there's this brand new book, but it won't be the last one. There's more that are going to come, but I would like to, I better get a drink here. Kim said I could have a bottle with a beverage of my choice, but this is the very last chapter piece in this book, and it's kind of an epilogue, or it's just an overview, and it takes place a long time after the events in the rest of this. And I don't think I give anything away from the rest of the book if I read this. There's one thing I should say. I was educated in grade school by the Sisters of the Blessed Virgin Mary at St. Anne's, and we called them the BVMs. And we used to say, that stands for Black Veiled Monsters. So those poor women, by the way, they had 50, 60 kids in the class, and some of them went nuts, and I understand why. It was almost an impossible job they had. So the BVMs were all dressed in black. That's one of the things I talk about earlier in the book, the BVMs. Here we go. It's called Up in the Air. The company died and the union died, but as of this writing, there's one mine left in Butte, the Continental Pit, operated by some other company, run without a union, scooped out of the grave of the Columbia Gardens. There really was an ore body down there. I don't know if you remember how people said, there's no ore down there. They're just miserable corporate, miserable guys. But there it is, there was. And the Continental opened, and then it closed, and it opened and closed, and now there are maybe 350 people working there. That's compared to, in 1900, 10,000 miners were working underground in Butte. In 1982, they shut down the pumps, and the water loaded with acid and dissolved metal slowly filled the 10,000 miles of tunnels and eventually turned the Berkeley Pit into the deepest lake in Montana. When we were kids in high school, we'd talk about the pit of the future turning into the lake, and we imagined blue water gleaming with silverboat trout. We didn't know what was going to happen. But the last time I saw the pit's water, it was kind of a transparent old blood color, shading down to ultramarine. No fish in the pit, though they have found some interesting mutant microbes. The Butte is still there. High above Roach Ridge, where we used to smoke, and on top of the Continental Divide, there's a 90-foot tall statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a BVM. Except this one is all white, as though dipped in snow, and she's Our Lady of the Rockies. When the statue was under construction, Robin said it resembled a giant, he was a friend of mine, Robin Evans. His sister was Monica Evans. He said it resembled a giant albino Darth Vader. And then when the statue was complete and lighted up at night, I said the slope of the mountain below could be carved into a gigantic automotive dashboard, with the lady on top as a glow-in-the-dark dashboard Madonna. We were smart-ass kids, there's no getting around it. But it was the old company guys who built that statue, built it themselves, the miners and muckers and truckers and welders. And sometimes it just seemed like they wanted to get something up there in the high fresh air, away from the heat and dust and dark of underground, away from the Berkeley lake of poison, something reaching for the sky. We still have blood in Butte and ashes. We go back maybe twice a year for Thanksgiving or maybe the 4th of July. When my brother and sisters and I were kids, there were 4th of July nights when so many fireworks were blown off that smoke haloed the streetlights like fog. Dave and I were the firecracker guys. We'd drop them into garbage barrels. We'd set off whole packs in chain reactions. We'd blow up anthills or fire tin cans into the stratosphere. We'd dissect firecrackers and collect the silvery powder, dreaming of bigger explosions. My younger sisters, Peggy and Lori and Janice, were partial to those colorful little poppers. They looked like spherical M&Ms that went off when you threw them down to the sidewalk. And also like snakes, those black cylindrical pills you kindled to release uncanny coils of ash to stain the garage floor. My sister Kathy, my older sister, preferred sparklers. With a sparkler, she could write letters on the night air, one after another, flash and fade. Once she told me she was trying to figure out a way to sparkle Kathy so swiftly you can see her entire name against the dark. Okay, I don't know, I'll take questions, or if you want, I can take another drink.
I just wondered if you ran into Chris Martin in the Rumpus Room. I'm going back to the 60s.
I went to the Rumpus Room.
Yeah, I was never in there, but
I was entertained there.
that was the beginning of rock and roll in Butte.
Yeah. You could go back and, there's some rock and roll in the 50s in here too. Bob Kowalczyk and people like that. Yeah. There's a scene in this that takes place at the Rumpus Room.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
But
And where was the rumpus room?
it was in it was in the alley, right off
It was
of,
on, go ahead, Jim.
It started downstairs under the Rialto Theater.
that's right.
Then it moved down on Park Street. It's like the Extra Dance building right in there, but you went in the alley.
Yeah, I remember going in the alley.
Yeah.
It's right above Whitehead's,
Whitehead's,
Yeah,
exactly.
and it is
That's
currently
right.
a ballroom dance studio.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
it's-
I think the one in the alley was room 71.
Room 71, that was another one.
Yeah.
No, that was downstairs.
See, I knew that's
Because he moved downstairs later and
Okay.
it was 71 Park.
I knew debates would start.
See, that's why I asked, because I've heard so many different
Oh, you
answers.
do?
And this has not cleared it up.
This is the whole thing, but there's different theories and
Yeah.
people have these memories. It's fun.
Yeah.
That's how
I'm
some
a
of these
dancer,
legends-
and the lady that owns the studio will say that
Oh,
is the
yeah.
rumpus room, so
I
I don't
knew that.
know.
But I had
I
also
think
heard
that's
other
right. I think that was
places.
the
Yeah,
rumpus
but
room.
it's
Yeah.
upstairs,
You know,
so I don't know about
that's
anything
the
else.
different
Yeah.
location too, right? Theoretically.
Steve,
Yes, sir.
I don't know if you recognize me, but we went through grades 1 through 12 together.
Jack.
You're right, right. And I just have a question on, in your acknowledgements, you start talking about the truth. And that raised my eyebrow right away because, and I know you're trying to protect, tell a good story, but not go overboard.
Right.
But it made me think of the infamous quote of a couple years ago from Rudy Giuliani when he was being interviewed by.
Stop it, Jack, stop it.
Yeah, and what I recall him saying is, well, the truth will come out, but it ain't gonna be the truth.
Yeah, I would hope not to be associated with them.
Oh, absolutely. No, and again, congratulations.
Well,
Good job on
thank you.
Your book.
Thank you. Yeah, I would stand with a lot of this stuff. And also, I try to say, this is what people were saying too. It's of course people who disagree. This is a storytelling town, and I would repeat the stories. Some of this stuff definitely happened, and my memory of them is pretty good. And I checked with some of my friends, like Artie Newman and another guy, Tom Staples was one I would hang around with, and we would corroborate things. And as Kim said, I came up to the archives and looked up some stuff. But, so it's as truthful. you know, it's not, there's some things, I don't know if anybody ever hear of this memoir called A Million Little Pieces that a guy came out with a time back. He just told so many lies, and that they found out, he said he was a rough, tough guy, and one day he got real wasted and crashed his car into a police car, and it'd take multiple policemen, you know, battling with him to take him in, and he kept fighting, and it was just a big mess, and he was in jail for 87 days. Somebody actually called his bluff. They looked up the records of that county that he happened to be arrested in, and they said, well, he was speeding, and he went to the police station and politely paid his fine, and that was it, you know, and you just, you know, but I would stand with most of the stuff in here, other than, you know, we all have different views of things. Yes, sir?
I was going to ask you, how long did it take you to write the whole book, and then how was your experience in trying to find an agent or a publisher?
Oh,
How did
God.
you publish it?
Well, this is, as they call it, independently published. That's what I ended up doing. I sent it to all sorts of, you know, people in the industry, and some people says, "Oh, that's interesting, but it's not a good fit." I don't know if anybody writes, but they always say, "Oh, it's not a good fit," you know. And they're right. But so I ended up, you know, doing what they call self-publishing or independent publishing, you know, and I ended up, you know, doing. I had to get this photograph, you know, it's from Mr. Richard Gibson, who gave me permission to do it, to take this and use it, and I had to create the cover with that, and you just have to do everything for yourself if you're self-publishing. So I didn't, you know, I didn't get an agent. I just, you know, and you know, who knows? You hear of self-published books catching on and you know, selling more and getting the attention of the people in the industry. So who knows? And it took me, well, kind of the point of my little speech here was that it just took all my life in a way to write it, because I would get this happened, and it just took me a while to realize that it was something worth writing about. And but it would take me, took me what, 3-4 years, you would say, to go from the idea of the memoir to the finished product.
And retiring.
Oh yeah, I had to retire. I worked as an environmental consultant in Spokane, and when I retired, I was able to attack my writing more. So.
And then you had to get a third mortgage on your house to publish the book.
No, it wasn't too bad.
Good.
It wasn't too bad, and you know, they send me as it sells here and there. They send me royalties. I got a royalty check for $1.38. Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Yes. Yes.
So who did you self-publish through?
Well, I did it a couple ways. I you know, and I hated to do this. I went through Amazon's publishing thing because, God, they just taken over the world. It just drives you crazy. But it seems like you have to make a deal with the devil to do that. So I had a paperback with them and also a Kindle book came with them. But a friend of mine pointed out that if you want to get into the independent bookstores, like Island Books, they don't want books to come from Amazon. And there are independent companies that will do this for you, and they distribute through independent bookstores and other bookstores. And the one I used was Ingram Sparks, and I think they did a pretty good job. I think it looks pretty good. So I did the hardcovers to that, and also an extra paperback because the bookstores mostly sell paperbacks. They move a lot better than hardcovers. See, I just wanted to sit in a room and write something, type it up, and then give it to somebody, and he said, "Oh, here's money," and then I go back and type it. But no, you can't do it that way. You can't do it that way.
I'm sure every starting author will tell that same story.
Right, right.
You mentioned earlier about your interaction with Richard Hugo.
Yes.
I was just curious, I think we probably were on campus about the same time, but I wasn't in that program, but I knew many of you came out of that. I was just wondering if you comment on the quality of that program and what it meant for you to be in.
Well, it was, you know, it's a very good program. Then in the 70s, I believe he died in 1980 or something. He had cancer, but also William Kittredge was there, and Rick DeMarinis was another good writer there, and it was good. And they couldn't, as I say, I had a good interchange with Hugo that helped me do a few things, but I wasn't really ready to learn how to write at the time, you know, and I was goofing off way too much, so, but it's a good program. I don't know how it is now, but it had a great reputation, and Hugo was kind of a legend there. Yes?
When you were taking those writing courses, were you mainly studying something else? Or were you full-time in the writing program?
Oh, geez, I go into that. I was a journalism major for a while, and I became an English literature major, and I took philosophy classes and science classes, and I would just go and I'd say, oh, that sounds really interesting, and I'd take it, and I was all over the place, and I enjoyed it, a lot of those things. I never did get my degree, by the way, you know. At the end, I realized you needed it at the time. It was not on the semester system. It was done in quarter credits, and you needed 180 credits to graduate. Well, I had 200, but they're arranged really weirdly. So I said, I'm going to go to Seattle. Bye.
So then a follow-up question, I gather you went into environmental engineering.
Yeah.
And so the follow-up question is, when you went into that other profession, did you, throughout that time, have this hankering to be a writer as well?
Yeah.
Or was it rekindled?
I was always writing this and that,
Okay.
you know. Some of it worked more. It's funny how I became an environmental consultant. To do a short version was this guy who needed somebody to write a business report. He had all these technical guys on staff, and some of them just could not write a coherent sentence to that same line. So I said, why don't you rewrite this and do something? And so I can write a sentence. So I did that, and I wrote other business reports, and he needed somebody to do some research, so I did that, and so I became an environmental consultant. It was just a pretty interesting job.
If there are no other questions, Steve, thank you so much. I really appreciated the process that you did.